The Automated Podcast.
Hi there, everybody. I'm Marc Verbenkov, host of the Automated Podcast, and I want to welcome you to the first year's final episode. So I will be returning to Canada for the month of December, and as I need to initially quarantine before spending time with family, I will be in a typical Canadian cabin in the woods, chopping firewood with limited tech access. So the podcast will have a little break, but we'll be back in January with new interesting discussions on the future of tech and automation. So it has been a really fun and interesting year putting this podcast together and having on what I think are many excellent guests. And I hope that you have derived as much value from the discussions as I have and are looking forward to more after the holidays. But on to this week's episode. So this week, I'm happy to have my very first return guest back onto the podcast. This is Serf Doesborgh and his colleague Jurriën Hamer from the Rathenau Institute in the Netherlands to talk about voice technology and its impact on society. For voice tech, think Alexa, smart home systems, and different kind of AI assistants. So we discussed the negative and positive repercussions that this tech will have, what governments can do to regulate or deal with it, and how the future might look like when it becomes ubiquitous. So Serf studied liberal arts and sciences at the University College of Maastricht, focusing on sustainability and technological innovation. During his master's European studies on society, science, and technology, he explored the societal issues regarding the automation of labor, and he is currently working on the theme of digital society and focuses on societal issues regarding virtual, augmented reality, and voice assistants. Jurriën, on the other hand, studied law and philosophy and attained a PhD at Utrecht University in 2017. He wrote his dissertation on the political meaning of human rights and conducted research at the London School of Economics, Government and Law. So Jurriën researches various topics in the realm of digital technology, ethics, and human rights. He explores developments in the field of artificial intelligence, voice technology, surveillance technology, and offensive cyber capabilities. Vital questions with regard to these subjects are the way these technologies can change society and how society should respond in order to handle such changes appropriately. Well, I am here today with Serf and Jurriën from the Rathenau Institute. Thank you very much, guys, for coming on to the podcast. And Serf, this is the second time that you're on, so thanks for coming back.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Glad to be here.
So I know that you discussed what the Rathenau Institute did in the previous episode that you were on, Serf, but for those who didn't have a chance to hear that episode, maybe you could just briefly, in a few sentences, what the Rathenau Institute does, because I think it's quite interesting and relevant for the podcast itself.
So basically, it's a research institute currently in The Hague, and we do research on innovations, science, and technology, and mostly look at what the societal impact and ethical concerns are with new technologies and scientific developments. And in that, we also advise Parliament and want to update the public with new information so that these debates can be held in a proper manner and that most people are of them.
I think it's a very interesting organization and what you do. And we will get into the kind of recommendations for government and for other stakeholders a little bit later on. But as we're talking about voice technology today, maybe I can get both of you to give a brief introduction to how you got interested in this initially, because I would assume it's not just a project that's laid on your desk, but there's actually some kind of personal interest in getting involved in voice technology and doing research on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, because I think first off, it is actually a little bit that it started off with the working program, because we have the working program of the Rathenau Institute that looks at what type of technologies are emerging, what types of issues are coming up. So within that, there is a category of immersive technologies. And we already talked about AR and VR in another podcast, but part of that is also speech technology. With signaling that speech technology came up, the Ratner Institute looked into that, and therefore it started the project on speech. But I think for my personal interest, one of the first things that I looked into was some of the people that are really excited about speech technology. And they said that like typing and working with the mouse and swiping and that kind of stuff, we always had to learn the language of the computer. And now for the first time, it was the computer learning our language. And I found that to be a really interesting statement. If that is the case, we'll get into that a little bit later, but I think that that sparked my interest at first. I'm curious, Jurriën, what was your first interest?
Well, what fascinates me, not only about voice technology, but also about AR and VR, is that it brings digital technology that much closer to our everyday lives and our everyday actions, right? So you have this picture of, well, I'm going to interact with digital world. I should, go to a computer and open it and type, and that's really becoming, outdated. I mean, now you're standing in the kitchen, and it's possible to talk to the digital world, right? And if you are wearing AR glasses and you're looking at your car, you can get all kinds of information immediately and ask questions immediately. So this kind of deep immersion in the digital world, which brings it that much closer and that much more kind of immediate into our lives, that's what really struck me as interesting and important to research.
Yeah, I couldn't agree further with you. In preparing for this discussion, I was reading about something like 40% of all US households already have a smart speaker that they're using. I know that all of us use smartphones that have voice assistants already embedded into them, but maybe if you could kind of set the stage for the European audience here. How many smart speakers are there in Europe, and are there any kind of projections that 80% or 90% of us will have smart speakers in our homes in the next 10 years or so?
So the numbers are mostly now for, like you said, for the US, it's almost 1/3 of the US that has smart speakers. And for the Netherlands, it's now around 19%, which is up from 5% in 2018. So it got quite of a big leap.
Yeah.
But yeah, some other countries but I think those are more numbers from 2019. Like the UK is like around 21, Germany around 12, and I think when we're talking about China, for example, that was about 22%, but that was again then only in 2018. So I think that's much more now. But one of the interesting things is that when you have a smart speaker, if a person has a smart speaker, they tend to use it also more on mobile phones because, like you said very well, the smart assistants or voice assistants are already present on mobile phones. So a lot of people have access to a voice assistant.
And so I guess, it's quite obvious that this trend of using voice assistants is growing significantly. In your research, was there any projection over the next, say, 10 years or so as the state of voice? Like, will it become ubiquitous? Will we all just naturally accept this? Or will there still be some places where, say, voice assistants and voice in general won't be used?
Well, that depends on whether certain roadblocks can be overcome, right? So voice will become ubiquitous if it is actually able to be this broadly useful companion, right? So because voice technology often comes in the form of a cognitive assistant that you can talk to and that can perform all kinds of tasks for you. And we see that certain kinds of tasks, for instance, asking your car, to put up the navigation and go somewhere, right? That works brilliantly, and it's becoming ubiquitous. But there are other kinds of tasks. Take, for instance, just having a really fun and natural conversation with a cognitive assistant, where you could say, well, there's a lot of development, but we're not actually that sure that we're going to be there, right, in 10 years, that everyone will think it is fun to engage with a cognitive assistant. So it really depends on whether the technology is able to take up all these different tasks. And if it is able to do that, it will definitely become ubiquitous.
Okay.
Yeah, and adding to that, it's not only the difference in tasks, it's also the difference in language, because of course the US has more of those smart speakers and is further developed because they started earlier, but it's also because of a lot of data that is available on the English language, and also why many of the other countries, for example here in Europe, are a little bit more behind on the development of this technology. So the main point to take away is that speech technology is not just one thing, but it really depends on the situation, on the language, and on the tasks.
Right, and that makes perfect sense why perhaps China is already ahead of some European countries, and probably why it might overtake many of the European countries if they have the one language that's spoken at a general macro level. I do want to talk very briefly about the technology itself, and I think it's going to be quite relevant for any kind of company moving forward. Is, how is a specific product brand chosen, right? If you say, Siri, I want cookies, for instance. How does Siri choose the kind of cookie that it recommends, or any other product?
Yeah, so mostly this is based on power dynamics, I think, because it's, and also on the connection that one company has to another company, because these companies, or the bigger companies, for example, Google and Amazon, that have those smart speakers, they are platforms, right? So you can go on that platform if your company wants to sell some products or wants to provide services. And once you're on the platform, you can, then you have your audience. But there's a big power play, for example, when you want to have Spotify, which is another big platform, on your product or on the platform. Because that is a big platform in itself. So for the smaller companies to get in there, it's harder than for bigger companies. And when we're talking about the example that you gave, for example, shopping, then it's mostly on default brands. So when you say you want a cookie, for example, what would be the default cookie? There are many different kinds, right? So again, there it's a matter of the trade that has been done before with, what kind of connections do they have to another company. And with that, that's more the shopping variant, but you also have the information variation, which is that all of the companies now need to be voice first, which means that the websites need to be updated so that smart speakers can look into them, so that voice assistants can actually scroll through the pages and give a correct answer. Because if it's not set up that way, then they will not be found, which is similar to the SEO or the Google search engine in that regard. To be really the first answer that pops up will become a bigger battle.
Right. So it's almost like there's a new layer in which businesses, brands, products, etc., need to be aware of in order to be even competitive, or not even competitive, but relevant on the market itself. I can see how, smaller brands that don't have the kind of capital to invest in things like this, they might be at a disadvantage compared to the larger brands, like you were saying, Spotify, or whatever kind of large cookie manufacturer is out there. They would have significantly more power, resources, etc., to make themselves the default choice for these smart speakers. I guess this is a natural segue into kind of the problems and concerns that we have with this technology, which I think you guys focus quite a bit in your research. What kind of problems? I mean, I guess the most apparent one is the destruction, or at least the reduced capability to compete on the open market for smaller brands, and then what it means for the communities that have these small brands in them. But maybe you guys can touch on a few other of the concerns and problems that you have found out with this technology.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I do want to emphasize, and I think you're very right to point out that this whole battle of kind of becoming the default option is somewhat unprecedented, right? I mean, the whole idea of a Google search bar is that you have priorities and you have some things higher on the list, some things lower on the list, but there's a lot on the list. And so there is this idea, right, that if you are a consumer or if you are a citizen, that you kind of still have control over lots of options. You're being broadly informed. And if you move to a world of defaults, then you can ask the question, well, it's certainly easier because you could just say, order a cookie, or just ask a question, get an answer. But is it really making us more autonomous? If we live in a world where everything around us is a default option, and where we actually have to work harder to get a variance of options. So that is, so you can approach that question of a default from the kind of the competition side, but there's also kind of the citizen side to it. right? We want the digital world to give us options and to make us more autonomous in our choices. But does it actually do that if it's a world of default options?
Right. Yeah, I would easily say no. Very bluntly. Serf, do you have any other points to that, or want to bring up another concern that you've seen with this technology?
Well, I think one thing to get out of the way anyway is the elephant in the room that has been discussed many times before, is of course also the privacy concern, but also a little bit of the ignorance of how technology works. So I have been in the voice community a little bit more during our research, and there were really two ways of viewing how the privacy concern went, because like probably many of you know and the listeners know, was that for smart speakers, people were listening in, which basically means that when you say the wake word, which is, for example, Alexa, and then do this and that, that a really small percentage of that goes onto the cloud and then is also being listened to for product development and for updating the algorithms in order to make it work. So for one side, many of the people in the voice community were like, of course, this is happening. This is very clear. But the outrage that popped up in the general public was really a big privacy concern, and rightly so. But the communication from the bigger companies that this was actually happening was, I think the biggest problem with that, because they didn't tell or communicate it correctly about that, and that's why there was this confusion among this whole privacy concern. And I think it's still a very important discussion to have, mostly because these smart speakers, at least, are in our home, and when we're talking about smartphones, we have them constantly with us. So if the communication about privacy is not being done correctly, then there can be a chilling effect. Like, there is somebody in my home right now, or some entity which always listens to me. Am I then really expressing myself in the way that I want to, or am I not? And when I invite some other people into my room, do I then have to say, oh, well, there is a Google Home in my apartment. Should I tell you or not? Are you comfortable with that? Those questions arise, which I think is a very interesting discussion to have moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's it's both a scary idea to have in one's head, but also, as you said, a highly relevant one. Because, yeah, if you're uncomfortable interacting with other people, or just say being yourself in an authentic manner when you're, say, alone at home or just with one or two friends, then this technology is having a drastic impact on the social interactions and just the way of living in all the places that it will be implemented in, which I think is quite a profound shift in the way that we would be dealing with each other in the future, no?
Yeah, definitely. And it really comes down to the trust we have in the technology and the developers of this technology, right? So how is that trust going to look like in 5 or 10 years? Are things arranged in such a way that there is this trust? We don't think there will be abuse. We think the rules are in place, so we don't mind if there's a smart speaker in the background and we're visiting someone. Or will there be a world in which we begin the conversation with, well, are there microphones and cameras around? All right, let's turn them off, and let's be together and have a private life. And I can't say right now which way we're going. I mean, there are serious concerns, and you see that companies are trying to address them, but I wouldn't be able to say, well, they're going to address them in such a way, definitely, that this trust will be there in 5 years or in 10 years. I can imagine a future where this trust will definitely erode, and where we do want to just turn off the microphone, turn off the camera, and have a private life.
Yeah, and I think this is something that we're seeing maybe more clearly now in the United States, where we have like discussions of breaking up these monopolies like Facebook and Google, et cetera, where I think for the majority of people who are paying attention to this, the trust in these larger entities has been eroding substantially over the last only few years, right? Maybe the big event was Cambridge Analytica, and the
Yeah.
fallout that came from there. But I think there's also another point to this where these larger companies have their own security for their own data. Whereas, say, if this data were to be collected by other smaller entities, they might not have the capability to protect that data from, say, cyber attacks. And this kind of leads to my question, like, how likely is it that there are nefarious agents listening to you rather than just, these large tech companies that are listening to you speaking in your home to collect data in order to sell you other things? But what are the chances, maybe now and in the future, that there are, say, foreign agents that are listening to the conversations of people in their homes, or of senators or people in
Yeah.
parliament, etc.? What's the chances of that happening?
Well, I think what's really important to keep in mind is that people who want to abuse the technology have specific targets, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it was a fascinating Dutch article about the intelligence services of our military, saying to Dutch companies, if you're going to discuss business secrets, lock up your phones, put away
Right.
the microphones. You can't guarantee the security. You just can't. So just don't try it. Don't do it. And I think what this reflects is that even though cybersecurity has been on the agenda for well over a decade now, we're not succeeding in making it really secure if there is a competent adversarial agent who wants to hack you. And if you have information, if you have secrets that are of interest to that agent, for instance, China. So if you are a big company with a lucrative plan, or if you are a Chinese citizen living abroad, then you may well be a target, and you may well not be able to protect yourself fully. Our own intelligence service is saying, just don't risk it.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to make yourself secure enough.
Let me add one more point to that, and which adds, I think, a little bit more weight to the discussion as well, which is that voice technology really unlocks a new type of data as well. It's not only the data that we're used to, like you talked about with Cambridge Analytica, but one of the most fascinating findings I found when I went into this research is that the voice itself has a lot of information in it as well. And that is what companies and also scientists are working on, unlocking or checking how that actually works. So, for example, most of the technologies are working to check your voice and put it into text so that we can understand what the communication is. But it's also how a person says something, which, because now we're talking and we can distinguish that we're all males, and might suggest that we're in a certain range for age group.
Mm-hmm.
But also sometimes when we're having somebody on the phone, I can distinguish actually who it is as well. Or even if somebody is drunk or sleepy. We can all do this by ourselves, but the companies are working on this kind of information extraction as well. And once all the smart speaker companies are having all these data and having these audio tracks, those speech tracks, they're sitting on a much bigger goldmine of information that was previously thought.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't really considered the fact that voice is much more data rich rather than just typing in a question into Google. If you actually say it, you're conveying so much more information than just the basic text.
Yeah, which can also be used for really good purposes, of course, because one example is the COVID pandemic. So they're really taking recordings and checking out if we can signal or diagnose some really early corona symptoms, because it has something to do with the lungs and the speech that we might not be able to detect, and then help battle the pandemic a little bit as well. So I think that should not be forgotten as well.
Yeah, I guess like any technology, it's a double-edged sword, right? There's good and bad implementations of it. One of the questions that I was thinking about when you were talking, Jurriën, was there seems to be this ability to speak to these devices that seems to be getting easier and easier. One of the articles that I came across while preparing for this was it's typically women's voice that are used in these, say, Siri or the other smart speakers at the home.
Mm.
Was there a specific reason to choose a woman's voice compared to a male's voice, or a completely neutral voice?
I think so, and there's certainly bias there, right?
Hmm.
So it isn't a surprise, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that there are all these submissive, spontaneous women gladly taking our instructions, really wanting to be of help and of service. I mean, this is a huge stereotype, and this speaks to the cultural impact of voice technology, which is being these points are really being raised now, right? If these are our new conversational partners, then we want them to reflect, real people and society in kind of all its broadness and diversity. And that's not the situation we have now. The situation we have now, still mostly, although developers are working on options to kind of diversify, there's still this dominant idea of the, willingly helpful and kind of submissive lady, gentle lady, who is there to assist us.
Right, and I would assume that this is predominantly in order to help manipulate or nudge the user to say buy more products or spend more on these apps, etc., to kind of facilitate that interaction or decrease the friction in that interaction to just spend more money to make these tech giants a little bit more money.
Yeah, and this engagement point can catalyze it, right? So they want us to be more engaged with a certain stereotype, so then we are more engaged with a certain stereotype, and that stereotype will impact our thinking more. And at some point, we'll be talking to, I don't know, another woman who has a feisty character and who is not there to help us at all, but who is there to challenge us. And then and then we could feel really uncomfortable because that's not what we're used to. We're used to Siri, and Siri doesn't treat me that way. This is how culture works.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the prime examples for the disaster of Apple was when some people asked or said to Siri, like, Siri, you are a slut. The response was, I'd blush if I could, taking it as a compliment, which really emphasized that it was male white developers in Silicon Valley that put that in, because otherwise that, of course, wouldn't happen at all.
Right. Yeah, I think so of course this is concerning, but I think also the perhaps just philosophically interesting point is that even just a simple thing of having one gender's voice versus the other being used in such a way will have potentially such a drastic impact on the population, especially if we see this kind of future vision of voice tech being kind of ubiquitous in the next, I don't know, pick a number, 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, we see how digital technology impacts our culture. I mean, look at social media and our public debate, which is crucial to our culture and how it functions. We see the impact can be huge and have so much unintended consequences. And we have to try to get ahead of that. So if you see voice technology becoming more and more popular, you have to ask these cultural questions, look at the cultural impact, and try to be, well, a little bit more on time in kind of course correcting. And trying to make it contribute to a richer culture and not, demolishing something that actually we should hold dear.
You see the impact also vice versa, right? So these discussions are being held more often, which also leads to now that you can choose more options of voices, different male voices, different female voices, and that there is even a development of a gender neutral voice as well.
Okay, so there are already some attempts to remedy this potential large societal problem. Okay, so it seems like we've discussed several of these concerns about the technology. I don't think we want to get the audience too depressed about the future of voice. There was this one point about the potential benefit of it, specifically with COVID tracing. But I know that the Rathenau Institute and your research always tries to propose recommendations for government and for other stakeholders. Maybe we can jump into that if there's nothing else that we want to discuss concerning the problems.
Yeah, that's fine by me. I think one of the interesting things is, we touched upon that a bit already, is how are you going to get the data to train these voice systems? And there is a risk that certain groups aren't properly, well, in the end, serviced by these systems because their data isn't, represented enough in the collection. And then you can, for instance, think about children or older people, not tech savvy young people who are 25 years old. But it brings a challenge with it, which is how do you collect this data in a responsible manner? Because what we do not want and absolutely should avoid is kind of exploiting the privacy of children to get our databases up to date. So what we propose is that the government gets involved here, and that the government sets up proper procedures to make a collective voice database on which you can build software which is inclusive, which is diverse, which pays attention to different accents, which might not be that interesting to big developers, and step in here. So that you have the proper data, but you also have proper procedures to get it, and you avoid the exploitation which can occur if developers are really keen on getting their data sample more representative.
I think what Jurriën touched upon with the more elderly people. I mean, there was a Dutch experiment already done as well. So when it is actually inclusive, when it is actually helping, voice technology can be very useful. For example, for seniors, that was an experiment with some smart speakers that seniors got, and they really felt that they could use that technology in a much easier and better way, and were much more self-reliant. So in that sense, because you started off not to scare too many people off, there are many really good developments in that regard as well.
And maybe one of the questions that I have to follow up from all this is, so these are obvious, terrific recommendations for the government to put into place. What's the likeliness of them actually being put into place compared to, as we were talking about at the beginning, these kind of power dynamics, even just for the kind of the default product or the default app. But I think we are now seeing quite a large power grab with a lot of these large tech giants out there that have tremendous influence on governments across the world. So maybe it's a bit of a tricky answer to give, but we have these recommendations for governments. We kind of know at least one path to go down, but what's the likeliness that these tech giants will influence those recommendations and not have them being put into place?
So I would say there are two things the government has to do, right? So the government has to be a competent regulator of technology, and the government has to be a builder of a technological society. And the development we've seen over the past 10 years is that, especially in Europe, the government has become more competent in regulating, also just more gutsy, right? So especially on the EU level, most recently with influencers and advertising regulation, you see the EU really stepping up and laying down the law, and this has a tremendous impact also globally. Other countries are taking their lead, and also companies are not operating or not solely operating in Europe are taking their lead from this new regulation which is being drafted. So I think you can be optimistic about that. You can be positive about that. There is a powerful lobby going on, but you see, especially the EU stepping up as a regulator. I think it's much more difficult for governments to have the competence to step up as a builder of, digital society, which setting up a database, it would be an example of that. You can't get that just by regulating. You have to build stuff. You have to invest, take matters into your own hands. And there, I think we have much further to go. And that means that there will be a big dependency still on these big technological companies that do have the competence to build digital society. And that will pose significant challenges. So that would be my answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would see that there might be a conflict of interest at the start if these databases are to be created, but if it's the big tech giants that are the only ones that have the capabilities, it might be a bit problematic.
Yeah, I think that it's also that you can actually promote doing it in a way together, and because also governments can, like Jurriën said, facilitate. One example is that in Singapore they actually build a national speech corpus, so that smaller companies can build on the more dialect Singaporean language, and that they're not too much dependent on the bigger companies, which then increases, of course, the competition and how the market is operating. And so that's also why I think a discussion is needed in collaboration of having the government there, talking with civilians, with developers and the bigger companies, and to do in fact something like that together.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, so I guess when I was reading these articles to prepare for the discussion, there seemed to be quite a bit of negative outlook. But if you guys have looked into it significantly more and you say that there is this kind of positive path forward, maybe I'm a little bit more reassured about this technology now than before. The central theme of this podcast itself is, how does this technology impact jobs? We've touched on it, I think, here and there, but I kind of just want to open the floor to either or to both of you to explore this. How will voice impact jobs currently or in the next couple, 10, 15 years or so?
Yeah, I would say, but Serf, you should add to that. So what they're really trying to get into, for instance, considering healthcare, what they're really trying to get into is that if you have a question about your health or about a certain recipe or about your medical data, that you can call the hospital, you will talk to a cognitive assistant, and that assistant will give you enough of an answer to satisfy you, right? And so that would be huge if kind of the first line of contact between patients and hospitals would be cognitive assistants. And the same goes to for other types of call centers. So the potential to replace jobs is pretty huge. The question is whether they will really be able to kind of get the competence on these specific tasks, right? So if you're talking about the medical context, are these systems capable of really learning medical terminology? And are they going to be flexible enough to engage in a good way with people who are calling? And companies are working very hard to attain these goals. And if you look at the money that's going in, I would not be surprised if in 5 or 10 years they would succeed. And then the potential impact on jobs would be pretty substantial, I would say.
Yeah, and with that, it's also the tasks that some of these technologies can take over. So it's not the full jobs, because when you're talking about speech technology, mostly we think about assistants. But for example, transcription software is also voice technology, setting it over into text, which is getting much better as well for analyzing full meetings, which can take over many administrative tasks. And other maybe translating tasks, for example, the Skype call translation, like instant translation from one language to another, is another way that it can take over potentially some jobs, but mostly also some tasks, and make the life of some people much easier as well.
So I think that this kind of augmentation of the tasks, right? Not the entire job itself, but the tasks within those jobs is key, and will continue to come out in many of the industries that we see, being talked about in this podcast. I do want to go back to the discussion of the hospitals itself, because it really seems like that might be one of the more challenging industries to automate, or at least that basic first person on the scene support to somebody who needs medical attention. But I could definitely envision that this is being used in all sorts of places where you have to call in to get information from a business, from a public institution. I mean, I live here in Barcelona, and the amount of times that you have to phone the city hall just for basic information is quite numerous. I could very well imagine that you could just pick up a phone, and rather than talking to these annoying voice recordings, that you're actually able to engage with an AI voice bot that would be able to give you the information that you need, and maybe even schedule a meeting when you can go and see the human representative at the city hall or wherever else that this is going to be implemented. But to me, it just seems like the hospital is kind of one of the more challenging places where there are significantly maybe more low-hanging fruit opportunities on the horizon.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't underestimate it. So the reason I mention it is because of the investment that you see
Okay.
from the big tech companies. They really want to get into this, and it's because there are a lot of so not just not I have an emergency and I want to call someone, but rather all these basic information questions. There are a lot of those as well in the medical sector, right? I've taken some sort of basic test and I just want to hear my results and am I COVID positive or not? So there's a lot of these, the simpler tasks as well. But I completely agree with you. So in this kind of, the call service kind of world, this could be a major development.
Don't forget also about the way of automation, right? We talked about also recognizing somebody's voice, which can be also a way of biometric identification, so that is automated as well. You don't have to fill out your forms or ask when you were born, like all those types of information, which speeds up some of that process as well. But of course, there are some issues that come along with that right away as well.
Right. Yeah, that's clear. I think it also makes more sense. Of course, we're living in a COVID era, and if all the money, or maybe not all, but if a vast majority of the money is being invested into the healthcare system, it makes sense that might be one of the first places to have this kind of automated AI voice assistant implemented in many of these hospitals. I do see that the time is kind of running out here. Maybe one of the last things that we can touch on is kind of the future vision that you guys have for voice technology, right? I keep putting out these 10 to 15 year examples, but one of the things that I saw was this Google duplex, which I think was one of the viral videos a few years ago, where you speak into your phone and you say, Google, book me a hairdresser appointment. And the Google voice assistant sends out the call and has a conversation with the hairdresser and books the actual appointment, where all you do is input a command. How far away are we from seeing that? Is that already out there? Is that already visible for some people? Or is this really what we're going to be moving into over the next 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, you don't. Yeah, that's a really prominent example. But there's also you have to keep in mind that that's a very specific task to do. So all that effort that is going in there to make that really effortlessly and seemingly human, that's a lot of effort putting into one task. And with that example, there's also like it has been used a couple of times, but when it often fails when people are using it, they're directly connected to somebody else who is actually a person to continue the conversation further. But of course, the developments are coming and it's becoming better as well, which for me really signals another ethical discussion, like when do you actually know that somebody is human or not? Because afterwards, Google also added, you're now talking with the Google Assistant, which is, I think, a very key point, because when do you know that it's a person or not? And how do we deal with that will be an upcoming concern.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, if you're looking ahead 10, 15 years, part of the discussion will be technological advances. But a large part of the discussion, maybe the major part of the discussion, will be what kind of culture do we actually want to live in? How do we actually want to interact with computers? So if you look at bots on Twitter, for instance, I don't think a lot of people are very happy and enthusiastic about that. I mean, it's a very successful example of automating something. But if you discover that someone is actually a bot, yeah, that doesn't sit well. That doesn't really match with the kind of public culture that we want to have. So a large part of this is going to depend on how do we actually want to interact with computers in our culture, and that will have a major influence on the kind of applications that will break through, and that will be embraced by the public.
Well, I don't think that there's a better question to end on. I want to thank both of you for coming onto the podcast. Very much appreciate your time and the discussion points that were brought up. I will have, of course, your profiles with the Rathenau Institute in the show notes. There is already a report that discusses voice tech, but it's in Dutch. I believe that there's an English version coming out. Do you have any ETA on that?
I'd say 2 months or so, that would be feasible. But it depends. They're busy in the communication department.
Right. Okay. Well, when it's out there, shoot me an email and I'll put it up on the show notes as well. Because I think that the report would definitely go into further elaboration of the points that we talked about, and I think that this is, as we discussed in the conversation, quite an important technology for business, but also for kind of greater societal impacts that it could bring out in the next couple of years. So I think it would be very interesting for many audience members to look into this.
All right.
Just thank you very much for both of you for coming on. Really appreciate your time. And,
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And I guess if there's another future report in the next couple months or years or something like that, I'd be happy to have one or both of you back on.
Thanks a lot.
So thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you want to support the podcast, you can leave a like or a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to get in touch, feel free to do so over Twitter or LinkedIn by searching for Automated Podcast. On the website, automatedpodcast.org, you can leave a comment on any of the episodes, read the transcripts, and look at the sources I use in all of these episodes. There are also blog articles and additional resources and information on this topic and podcast if you are looking for more. See you next week.
The Automated Podcast.